Simons and Lewis, over a decade ago now, shocked the linguistic community with a stark warning. Over 19% of the world's living languages are no longer being passed down to children. That's a death sentence for thousands of tongues, some of which we've looked at previously on this channel. Hi folks, I'm Learn Hittite, and today we're tackling a great question from viewer AlexKuz, who posted the following on my recent Proto-Tungusic video. What do you think can be done to preserve endangered languages such as Tungusic? Do you have any ideas or examples? And I thought to myself, that's a curious question, right? And one which has actually been asked a few times before, so I thought it's high time that I made a video on it. But this video is more of me trying to gauge opinion on the issue, especially because it's a topic a lot of people have some quite strong opinions about. I remember several years back now, a video British comedian David Mitchell released on his YouTube channel where he admittedly rather politely spoke about his concerns around the funding of endangered languages, with the one in question being Scottish Gaelic. However, resulting from this video, he got quite a bit of backlash online, so much so that it appears the video has been delisted from his channel, although interestingly The Guardian still host a copy where for some reason they avoid referring to Scottish Gaelic in the subtitle of the video and instead, bizarrely, just use the term ancient languages. I would play for you the entire video, but I don't want YouTube's content matching tool to shout at me, so I'll just leave this text on screen. Either way, it's safe to say there are some mixed opinions out there on the issue of language death. But first off, how do we even know a language is endangered? Well, indexes like Ethnologue and UNESCO categorise language vitality in similar-ish ways, evaluating a multiple of different factors like institutional support, intergenerational transmission, the attitudes of society, whether decent materials are available to learn the language, and so on, things like this. But oftentimes individual researchers who are working with a particular language or language group can sometimes have their own criteria. And these various categorizations of language vitality can sometimes disagree with each other. So one language may be considered as stable in one index, whereas another index categorizes it as endangered or something like that. Take Cockab, for example, in Namibia, where I've done some fieldwork before. Ethnologue actually categorizes it as, I believe, an institutionalized language. So it's not considered endangered by that index. It's recognized nationally. There's growing content and usage of it online. But on the other hand, local teachers tell me that fewer kids are actually speaking it at home, or fewer kids are using it with their families. Material quality for learning this language is dated, and that the language is somewhat seen in a negative light by some community members. And when you put all this together, it presents, I don't know, like a nervous outlook for the language's future. But more importantly, many specialists who work with the language also confirm this is a worrying perspective for the future. Now, in the case of Cockab, a major reason for its decline is not just competition from, super regional languages like English or languages like Afrikaans. Smaller local community languages are also competing with each other in this space too. Some families might prioritise certain local tongues for their children over others. In the case of Cockab, often it is competing with, say, Herero in the community. And we've actually seen data showing a slight decrease in the number of Cockab speakers over time, conversely with an increase in the number of Herero speakers overall. Now, the real language dynamics in communities are often complex. Many people will actually eventually grow up speaking Cockab and Herero. But the point is that this competition among neighbouring regional languages, this kind of push and pull, between the languages is a subtle but powerful overall driver of decline that I sometimes think is overlooked. And we'll see this dynamic playing out, or we'll see how it has already played out in the decline of Tungusic, and we'll come to that in a moment. If you would like a specialist opinion on language shift and death in Africa, instead of just listening to me, well then I suggest checking out Batibo's work, which we can see on screen now. Generally speaking, the author highlights a path in language decline from healthy bilingualism to ultimate language death via what the author calls superordinate, subordinate contact. That is basically when there's a prestige gap between the two languages. I do not deny for one moment that this is the main driver behind language shift and therefore language death. I do contend that coordinate contact between two minority languages can also trigger language shift, because, in my opinion, coordinate contact, and what I mean by that is when two languages have the same prestige value, is actually likely quite rare. Always there is some prestige differential, and this will cause language shift when bilingualism is present. Cockab undoubtedly is faring far better than many other languages across the world that only have a handful of elderly speakers left, like certain varieties of Tungusic. Now, what to do when a language is on the brink like this? Well, what is sometimes known as salvage fieldwork is required, which is essentially like urgent efforts to document a language before it's gone by recording, it's the sounds, words, grammar, and hopefully the production of some peer-reviewed output like a sketch of the language or grammar of the language, which linguists will be able to utilise in future studies. A perfect example of this would be Juliette Blevins' work on Nhanda in Australia. And we've actually spoken about this before in her video on the Proto-Indo-European Eoskarian hypothesis. Now, before Blevins' efforts, almost nothing had been formally documented concerning this Australian language. And Blevins, by working primarily with just one of a handful of speakers left, she created and published a complete grammar covering, phonology, morphology, syntax, lexicon, everything that you could basically need to study the language. Now, critics have rightly pointed out that the limits of Blevins' study, because she relied on the input mainly from a single speaker, although there was input from elsewhere. Yes, it can be difficult to detect and siphon through influence from other neighbouring, regional, possibly endangered languages that the speaker might have had contact with during their life. The output for sure is going to be idiosyncratic, but at the end of the day, Blevins' work is simply invaluable, and it's a great example of what should be done in such situations. Because at the end of the day, this kind of salvage study provides a foundation for any potential revitalisation of the future, and of course preserving the language so linguists can look at it and study it in the future. So that's really the priority, in my opinion, when it comes to moribund tongues. If documentation hasn't been done, it needs to be. Fieldwork is absolutely essential, and even if there is some grammar or sketch available, more data is always better while we have the ability to collect that data. Now let's focus on the Tungusic languages, the heart of the original question by the viewer on preservation. We're actually in a better condition here regarding documentation and speaker numbers than many endangered language groups around the world, although the situation is still very worrying. Manchu, for example, has an extensive written corpus, while like Evenki is backed by a decent body of linguistic study, and also I think there's still a few thousand speakers remaining, with kids still learning it in parts of Eastern Russia. Evan shows some promise because there's evidence that at least some children are still picking it up alongside other languages, but many Tungusic languages like Kilen in China are critically endangered, with a handful of speakers left at best. And to be honest, Killen's a prime target for salvage fieldwork. There's one decent grammar, if I remember correctly, on the language already published, but there's still many features of Killen which could be described better, in better detail, and actually Killen is a very difficult language to place on the Tungusic language family tree. We know it's a Tungusic language, but where and what it's related to closest remains unclear. So we need more data to help sort that out, for example, from a linguistic perspective. Now, most of the data that I'm about to give you comes from this book, The Tungusic Languages, and this is obviously the book that I based my video on Proto-Tungusic on. And there's an interesting chapter about the socio-linguistic status of the Tungusic languages, and I thought we could go through some of that detail here. For example, curiously, since the 1950s, ethnic Tungusic populations have actually grown in size. Evenki, for instance, rose from about 32,000 to over 37,000 by 2010, according to the available data for that relatively short period. And obviously I want to point out that these are just approximate numbers, but still. Important, however, is that fewer people actually speak these languages. Evenki speakers plummeted from 19.5% to just 11.5% of the ethnic population. Evan shows a similar trend, and others, like Nanai, are fading fast, with some nearly extinct. The key takeaway is that although the total number of people identifying as Tungusic has increased, the number reporting Tungusic language ability has declined. So you might ask yourself, well, why? And again, it's not just the dominance of, like, for example, Russian, the big super regional language. It's also smaller regional languages like Yakut and Buryat, which are pulling speakers away from Tungusic communities. In Yakutia, most Evenki know Yakut or Russian far better than their own language, and this is often supposed to be due to mixed marriages, causing this shift and favouring certain regional languages over others. In certain regions, more Evenki speak Buryat than Evenki. So again, we get this pattern of one regional language's loss is actually another regional language's gain, much like we saw with the situation in Namibia, but perhaps to a greater extent with the Tungusic languages. Preservation efforts and revitalisation efforts do exist, but they're limited. In Eastern Russia, laws support Evenki and Evan being used in media and public spaces, but many other Tungusic languages lack any type of formal legal backing. In schools, languages like Nanai and Evenki are still being taught to small groups, like we're talking like tens of people, but it's often just 1 or 2 hours a week, and this education stops, I think, after the 3rd grade in primary school. Outdated textbooks are an issue, there's a lack of trained teachers, and actually inside the language classes have more of a cultural focus rather than second language acquisition. All of this stuff together seems to be holding things back. Digital efforts, on the other hand, is a bit more promising. Recently, there's been created a digital dictionary and digital Evenki learning app. There's also other online platforms, online groups for people who wish to learn Nanai and Evenki. Interestingly, there's some nomad schools for reindeer herders and their children, which I think is a cool idea for picking up Tungusic languages, but their outreach is quite small. And all sorts of many things. So there is some effort at language revitalisation and preservation. Again, more detail can be found in this book, but the general situation with Tungusic is, challenging. So if we wanted to revive these languages, probably some bolder moves are going to be needed. Immersion schools, like we see, for example, with the Maori in New Zealand, these could help build fluency. Of course, more digital materials the better for younger speakers, cultural events, extending beyond, nomad schools which have a limited reach. Tungusic could maybe copy some of the strategies used by Yakut and Buryat. Yakut, for example, is mandatory across all school grades, and I think they have up to 20 hours a week of Yakut education as a teaching medium in rural areas. Buryat is much less. It's only around 1 hour per week, but it's across all school grades. And I've read some reports that from next year, over 100 schools will actually test teaching core subjects in Buryat. Tungusic problems, by contrast, is the fact that, like we spoke about, Tungusic education stops after grade 3. At most, they have 3 to 4 hours a week, and rarely, or in fact never, have I seen any reports that other subjects like math, for example, are being taught in a Tungusic language. Adopting Yakut's intensive approach, or maybe Buryat's future immersion trials, could make a difference. But all of this obviously takes investment. And this goes for all endangered languages across the world, where increasingly people are finding that their education systems are strained, health systems are strained, teacher salaries cost money, textbook design and publishing cost money. I actually worked on a textbook design program in Turkmenistan about 13 years ago, and you wouldn't believe how much time, effort and money goes into designing, producing, publishing a textbook. Really, the sunk costs are unreal. Cultural events too, festivals, stuff like that, obviously it all costs money. And I read an article not too long ago from a First Nations organisation in Canada calling for a 10-fold increase in finance for Indigenous languages in order to truly, meaningfully revitalise them. On average, I think Canada has spent around $75 million per year over the past 5 years on the revitalisation of such languages. And, an increase, a 10-fold increase, is a big chunk of cash that people are asking for. Other communities around the world maybe don't have this cash available or want to spend it elsewhere. The biggest challenge, however, will always be that parents must continue to speak the language to their kids for long-term survival, because without that intergenerational transmission, whatever happens, whatever programs, projects we put into place, revitalisation efforts will always struggle. Then, coming back here to Batibo's work, the author suggests that by the time a language is not consistently being passed on to younger generations, then, it's effectively in a state of irreversible decline. The author also raises the question of at what point do we actually classify a language as being dead? The author does indeed state at one point during the chapter that a language is dead at the moment it stops being transmitted generationally. But other points may also be identified, like whenever the last speaker dies or when it stops being used in day-to-day conversation. The author attributes prestige differentials to the decline in language use, but when a language has already reached the point where it's not being passed on to younger generations, then it's likely in that case that socio-economic prestige is already non-existent, alongside practically zero demographic power. Reversing this seems a very difficult thing to do. Here it seems to be critical to tackle the prestige gap early on in a language's decline. But there are other problems too, because language decline occurs over time. The longer a speech community has been shifting to another tongue, the more likely its original language will show morphological simplification and lexical gaps in contemporary domains. So again, more challenges to overcome. And from a really selfish perspective as a linguist, is language death always a disaster if we document it well beforehand? Languages have always risen and fallen. Take the namesake of my channel, Learn Hittite, a once vibrant, illustrious, epic language of ancient empires. It's now extinct. But its loss isn't a total tragedy. We have a rich corpus of Hittite and related Luwian texts, some really cool stuff. mythology, war stories, ritual practice, and then boring stuff like administration documents. But we can look at the words, we can understand the grammar, we can study it, we can even produce textbooks to teach it today. I don't have any textbooks here, but we can produce textbooks to teach it today. And, you know, I'm very thankful for this documentation that exists and all of the published material around Hittite and its grammar, its morphology, syntax, stuff like this. All of those cuneiform tablets that were written for us back in the day by those Hittite scribes, I'm really thankful that they put that hard work in, and it allows us today to keep Hittite alive in a way, right? Letting us study it, read it, share in those stories and its legacy. But many moribund tongues still lack any level of documentation and analysis for them to be meaningfully studied outside of like a very narrow linguistic sphere. And of course, like, community identity can endure even when a language fades. And we see this with the Tungusic ethnic identity. It remains strong despite fewer speakers of Tungusic languages. I believe the salvage studies and the research are vital to preserve a language's legacy, but the fate of that language ultimately lies with the communities themselves. So let me know what you think. Is language death always a tragedy, provided we've done our salvage fieldwork? Is there more to language shift than just a prestige gap? I'd be genuinely interested to read your thoughts and ideas on the topic. Like, subscribe, do all that good stuff for the algorithm. I've got some interesting collaborations lined up, so keep an eye out for those. As always, you've been a fantastic audience. I've been Learn Hittite. Goodbye for now.